It was brutal how I left Josue. I practically destroyed him. Years later, he appeared at our high school reunion, successful and with a beautiful girlfriend by his side. I arrived fashionably late, and his girlfriend raised her glass to me. "Thanks for leaving Josue back then when he was down," she said with a sly smile. "If not for that, I wouldn't be with him now." I let out a soft laugh. "No problem," I replied. "I also have a toast." "Sorry for the delay, I had a blind date." As I opened the door to the private room, everyone stopped talking and stared. My heart raced when my eyes met Josue's. 7 years had changed him. The skinny teenager was now tall and muscular with sharp features. The tenderness in his eyes had been replaced with resentment and something more. He had his arm around a beautiful woman, and after a brief, cold glance at me, he looked away. His girlfriend examined me with the attitude of a woman sizing up her partner's ex. I assumed they must have discussed my history with Josue before I arrived. The atmosphere was charged with discomfort. Someone broke the silence. "Amaya, the reunion has been going on for a while. What took you so long?" I nodded apologetically as I looked around, noticing all seats were taken except the one next to Josue. Someone was probably anticipating drama, wondering if I would sit beside him. I walked over, unfazed, and grabbed the empty chair. The knowing smiles intensified, likely imagining a dramatic confrontation between the old love and the new girlfriend fighting over the guy. Josue gave me a quick, tense glance before lowering his gaze. His girlfriend, noticing his tension, coldly turned her back on me and possessively squeezed his hand. I didn't understand why they were so nervous. I simply took the chair, turned it around, and placed it in front of Josue. "Excuse me," I said to the person next to the now empty seat, "could you move a bit?" I sat down, raised my glass, and apologized to everyone for the delay. It was then that Josue's glass shattered. He froze for a moment before calmly asking the waiter for a new glass. The room started joking about my blind date and how he was potential marriage material, comparing him to Josue. The room fell silent as they realized their mistake, and everyone looked nervously at Josue and his girlfriend. Josue glanced at me furtively, and when our eyes met, he quickly looked away. His face was a mix of curiosity and something else I couldn't identify. Breaking the silence, I commented, "He's quite handsome, he's a doctor." Josue's knuckles turned white around his glass, and his voice was cold and sarcastic. "How much do you think he earns per month?" he said, his tone loaded with bitterness, as if he still blamed me for the past. We had once planned to go to UCLA together, but I wasn't admitted and ended up attending a local state university. I was about to tell Josue when his mother appeared at my door. "Amaya, I know you didn't get into UCLA," she said. "Please, I beg of you, don't tell Josue. He's crazy about you, he'll give up UCLA to stay with you. I worked so hard to get him where he is. I won't let you trap him in this small town." She handed me a debit card with money on it, saying it was compensation to make it clear I would never be her daughter-in-law. She wouldn't allow it, claiming my love would ruin him. She was practically crying. I told her I needed time to think. That night, she sent me a message with a photo of a kitchen knife, saying if I didn't break up with Josue, she would kill herself. Terrified, I replied that I would do it. I thought ending things with Josue would be enough, but his mother wanted me to play a role at the airport on the day he was leaving. Holding the debit card, I told Josue, "Your mom gave me $00000, it's over." Josue laughed, stroking my hair, saying it was funny and we were going to miss the flight. I pulled away with a cold expression. "I'm not joking, I'm not going to UCLA with you. Your mom gave me $00000, those are years of work I no longer have to do. Thanks to you, I'm set." His laughter stopped, replaced by tears. He grabbed my hands, scared like a child caught doing something wrong. "Amaya, what did I do wrong? Tell me, and I'll fix it," he pleaded. His mother appeared and pulled his hands away from mine. "He doesn't love you, Josue, you don't see it. She's a gold digger, not you," she said. Josue shouted at his mother and then turned to me with red, pleading eyes. Amaya, please don't leave me, he repeated, his gaze searching for mine. When I didn't react, he knelt down. People at the airport started staring and whispering as he crawled towards me, clinging to my clothes desperately. Amaya, someday I'll make so much money for you, please don't end things with me. I had never seen him so broken, begging as if he had nothing left. I knew if I stayed there any longer, I would give in. So, I pushed him away, put the card back in his mother's pocket, and said, I love money more than you. I walked away with the sound of Josue's despairing sobs echoing behind me. Back at the reunion, my classmate nudged me out of my thoughts. Marisol, Josue's girlfriend, was toasting to me. So, her name is Marisol, I thought. She raised her glass again. Thanks again for leaving Josue when he was poor. If not for you, I wouldn't be dating him now. She raised an eyebrow. And I heard you accepted $50,000 from his mother to break up with him. Nice trick, you've already spent it all. If you need more, I'll make sure Josue gives you something, consider it charity. The room fell silent, with everyone staring at me incredulously. Whispers spread, God, what a gold digger, no wonder Josue said she's obsessed with money. Josue stood up, putting his arm around Marisol and looking at me with anger. Don't waste your time toasting to a gold digger, she doesn't deserve it. I wasn't angry, just tired. I had carried the label of a gold digger for 7 years, I had served my sentence for his mother. I pulled out my phone, opened the chat with his mother's threats, and calmly placed it in front of Josue. The silence in the room was so thick I could hear the clinking of ice cubes in the whiskey glasses. As Josue looked at the screen, I saw his face go from confusion to shock and finally to a rage I had never seen before. What is this? His words came out stuttered as his eyes scanned the messages from his mother over and over. Marisol, in her tight red dress, seemed to scream look at me as she tried to lean in to see the screen, but Josue jerked the phone away from her view. My heart was pounding so hard I thought everyone in the room could hear it. 7 years, 7 long years carrying a lie that wasn't mine, watching the man I loved hate me for something I never did. And now, everything was about to change in a matter of seconds. Mom, Josue's voice resonated like thunder in the room. Where is my mother? Mrs. Mendez, who had been sitting discreetly in a corner of the VIP room, tried to stand up with dignity, but her legs trembled as much as her voice. Son, The cry from Josue made everyone jump in their seats. Don't dare call me son, not after this. He turned to Marisol, who had noticeably paled beneath her perfect makeup. You knew, Josue accused. Marisol's silence was all the answer we needed. Her eyes, once filled with disdain towards me, now showed the panic of someone watching their house of cards crumble. Of course, she knew, I said, my voice firmer than I expected. Why do you think she was so eager to humiliate me with the money? She knew the truth and chose to keep the lie to stay with you, Josue. Josue ran his hands through his perfectly styled hair, his eyes meeting mine for the first time in 7 years, and I saw not hatred but a mix of pain and understanding that broke my heart. Amaya, his voice cracked as he said my name. Just as he was about to continue, a sharp noise startled us all. Mrs. Mendez had fainted, or at least pretended to, delicately falling onto a nearby sofa. But this time, her theatrics wouldn't work. How convenient, Josue's voice was laced with sarcasm. You always faint when things get difficult, Mom. I stood up slowly, feeling all eyes on me. The room, once full of laughter and toasts, now seemed like the stage of a Greek tragedy. But this wasn't the end, it was just the beginning of something much bigger. We need to talk, I said softly, looking at Josue. There's much more you need to know. Marisol's eyes widened with panic. Josue, love, you can't believe her, it's obvious she fabricated those messages. How did she fabricate the bank statements I found on your laptop? Josue's voice was sharp as a knife. The one showing monthly transfers to an account in Panama? The collective gasp in the room was audible. Marisol looked like she had seen a ghost, and Mrs. Mendez miraculously recovered from her faint. In less than 10 minutes, the perfectly constructed world of lies began to crumble. But this was just the beginning, the real storm was yet to come. The next few minutes were a whirlwind of emotions and revelations. Josue, with a calmness that only foreshadowed the storm to come, pulled out his phone and projected several documents onto the VIP room screen. My heart skipped a beat when I saw the numbers, millions of dollars embezzled from the company. You know why I really hired a new auditor last month, Marisol? Josue's voice was deceptively soft. Because the accounts didn't add up, and look what I found. Marisol, who had moments before boasted about her relationship with a CEO, now looked like a porcelain doll on the verge of breaking. Her perfect mask of security crumbled with each new slide Josue showed. It's not what it seems, my love, she tried to explain, but her voice trembled. Your mother and I just wanted. Josue let out a bitter laugh that chilled my blood. Of course, she's involved. Why wouldn't she be? Mrs. Mendez stood up from her sofa, all pretense of fainting forgotten. Her usually impassive face, thanks to years of Botox, showed genuine terror. Son, everything I did was for your good, always for your good, for my own good, she said. Josue's voice broke as he spoke about destroying his relationship with me and stealing from his company, all supposedly for his own good. He remained silent, watching as years of lies and manipulations unraveled before his eyes. The other guests, who had previously whispered about my supposed greed, now looked horrified at the true villain of the story. I need some air, Josue murmured, loosening his tie. Without thinking, I followed him to the restaurant balcony. The city sparkled beneath us, oblivious to the drama unfolding in our small room. 7 years, he whispered without looking at me. 7 years hating you for something you never did, and 7 years loving you despite everything. I replied softly, you never told me the truth. He turned towards me, his eyes shining with contained tears. Why didn't you tell me the truth? Your mother threatened to kill herself, I explained, my voice cracking. And after seeing you leave, I discovered something more, something that makes the embezzlement seem like child's play. Before I could continue, a sharp cry interrupted us. We rushed back into the room just in time to see Marisol trying to delete something from her phone while Mrs. Mendez shouted, delete everything. But it was too late. Josue's auditor, who had been monitoring all corporate communications, had already sent copies of everything to the board. Not only did they steal from the company, Josue announced, his voice echoing through the room, but they used the money to blackmail other executives. The silence that followed was deafening. Marisol, cornered, looked at Mrs. Mendez for help, but she was too busy trying to contact her lawyer. And that's not all, I continued, feeling it was time to reveal the final piece of the puzzle. Why don't you tell them about the real reason you kept me away from Josue? I addressed Mrs. Mendez directly for the first time in 7 years. She froze, her phone falling to the floor with a dull thud. Her face went from panic to absolute horror as she realized I knew everything. Tell him, I insisted, fixing my gaze on Clara Mendez. Tell him about your husband's will. Josue's face transformed as he heard the word will. He turned to his mother, who seemed to have aged 10 years in the last few minutes. What are you talking about, Mom? I pulled out a yellowed folder from my bag, one I had kept for 7 years, waiting for the right moment. Your father left a very specific will, Josue, a will that your mother altered. Clara shouted, that's a lie, but her voice betrayed her panic. Roberto died intestate, everyone knows that. I opened the folder and pulled out a copy of the original document. I suppose this notarized signature by Notary Garcia is fake? I asked. The same notary who curiously died in an accident 2 days after I found this. Marisol tried to slip away towards the door, but one of the guests, who turned out to be a private detective, stopped her. I think you'll want to stay for this, he said. I continued, my voice trembling slightly, the will of your father specified that the company should be divided equally between you and your younger sister. Josue paled, saying, I don't have any sister. Clara Mendez collapsed into her chair, tears streaming down her face and ruining her expensive makeup. You shouldn't have known this, she said. Your father had a daughter before he married your mother, I explained softly. A daughter who was given up for adoption because your mother threatened to ruin Roberto's career if he didn't. The silence in the room was sepulchral. Josue leaned against the wall as if his legs couldn't support him. I do have a sister, I replied, turning to one of the guests who had remained silent until then. And you know her very well. Carmen, Josue's timid secretary, slowly stood up. Her eyes, identical to Josue's, shone with contained tears. I had discovered this years ago when I needed medical tests, but your mother threatened to destroy my career if I ever told Josue. Josue looked back and forth between Carmen and his mother, recognizing the undeniable resemblance for the first time. That's why I always felt a special connection with you, I added. And that's why your mother tried to fire you so many times, and why she kept me away from you, because she knew that eventually you would discover everything through me. Marisol, seeing everything fall apart, tried to play her last card. Josue, love, I didn't know any of this. Your mother manipulated me just like she did you, she said. But Carmen spoke with a hardness no one expected from her. Then why do I have copies of emails where you plan with Clara how to keep me away from Josue, with money transfers to your account every time you got information about me? The sound of sirens began to echo in the distance, getting closer to the restaurant. Clara Mendez stumbled to her feet, swaying. You can't prove anything, she said. You're wrong, Mom, Josue replied, his voice cold as ice. We can prove everything. The sirens grew louder until they finally stopped outside the restaurant. The sound of hurried footsteps up the stairs broke the tense silence in the room. Marisol made a desperate attempt to delete something from her phone, but a police officer snatched it from her hands as soon as he entered. Clara Mendez and Marisol Vargas, you are under arrest for corporate fraud, embezzlement, and obstruction of justice, the officer announced as they read them their rights. Clara began to hyperventilate. You can't do this to me. I'm Clara Mendez. Call my lawyer, she demanded, the same lawyer who had helped her falsify the will, I added calmly. I watched as they handcuffed Marisol, her red dress now stained with her running mascara. Josue, please, everything I did was for love, she said. Josue let out a bitter laugh. You call it love to steal millions from the company, to help hide the existence of my sister, to contribute to the destruction of my relationship with Amaya? I approached Carmen, who was trembling slightly, and hugged her. After so many years of keeping the secret, she could finally be who she truly was. Josue looked at us, and I could see the moment he accepted the truth. He had a sister, and I had sacrificed our love to protect that secret. Why didn't you tell me before? Josue whispered, moving closer to us. Your mother threatened to destroy Carmen's life if I spoke, I replied softly. I had already seen what she was capable of when she threatened to kill herself. But you kept the evidence all these years, Carmen said, looking at me with gratitude. Every document, every email, every bank transfer. I knew the truth would have to come out someday. As the police escorted Clara and Marisol out of the room, Clara stopped and turned towards us one last time. Her normally perfect and controlled face was distorted by rage and fear. I did everything for you, Josue, she shouted. To protect your inheritance. That bastard child didn't deserve a cent of your father's fortune. Carmen shuddered at the cruel words, but Josue hugged her protectively. You're wrong, Mom, he said. Carmen deserves much more than money. She deserves the truth, her family, everything you denied her. The officers began asking questions and taking statements. The VIP room, which had been the scene of a high school reunion, turned into a crime scene. The guests, still in shock, were evacuated one by one, leaving us alone with Josue, Carmen, and a couple of detectives. We'll need your full statements, one of the detectives said. This could take all night. I glanced at my watch. Only 2 hours had passed since I arrived late at the reunion. 2 hours that had changed our lives forever. Josue suddenly asked, what was in the wine glass that broke when you mentioned your blind date? I smiled weakly, pulling out a small device from my bag, a microphone. We needed to record your mother's confession. The next few hours passed in a haze as the police took us to the station for formal questioning. Sitting in an interrogation room with beige walls and a cold metal table, I recounted every detail of the past 7 years, every threat, every manipulation, every document I had carefully kept. The detective raised an eyebrow when I mentioned the blind date. Part of the plan, I confessed, feeling a slight blush on my cheeks. We needed to provoke a reaction. We knew Marisol couldn't resist the temptation to humiliate me, and that would make Clara let her guard down. When we finally finished, it was almost midnight. As I left the interrogation room, I found Josue waiting for me in the hallway. He had removed his tie and had disheveled hair from running his hands through it. Our eyes met, and without a word, he hugged me. "I'm sorry," he whispered against my hair. "I'm so sorry, Amaya." I allowed myself to sink into his embrace, letting 7 years of pain and longing melt away in that moment. "I'm sorry too," I replied. Carmen emerged from another interrogation room, her eyes red from crying. She tried to step back discreetly, but Josue extended an arm towards her. "Come here, little sister." And so, we stood there, the three of us hugging in a police station hallway at midnight, trying to process how our lives had changed completely in one night. Carmen suddenly smiled slightly in a cafe, saying, "You knew I always brought coffee to the office because that's how Dad met Mom." Josue let out a choked laugh, and I thought about how some things were just in our blood. I remembered noticing the resemblance between them, like how they both arched their eyebrows when something seemed suspicious. An officer approached us with more documents to sign. Reality was beginning to set in. There would be a trial, scandals in the newspapers, and a reorganization of the company. But for now, in this moment, we were just 3 people finding our way back to each other. "What are we going to do now?" Carmen asked, her voice small and vulnerable. Josue said, "First, I'll call the board of directors. They need to know the company will have 2 CEOs from now on." Carmen's eyes widened in surprise. "Josue, you can't," she said firmly. "You can and you must," she interrupted. "It's your right, it's what Dad wanted." I added softly, "Let's go to my apartment. I have something to show you." Both of them looked at me with curiosity and surprise. "What's the last one, I promise?" Josue asked. I pulled out an old photograph from my bag, one I had found in his father's archives. It was from when Carmen was born, showing a young Roberto Mendez holding a baby with a look of pure love on his face. On the back, in shaky handwriting, he had written, "My little Carmen, someday you'll understand why, but never doubt that I loved you from the first moment." The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows of the main office of Mendez Enterprises, bathing the 2 desks that now occupied the space. Carmen looked up from her documents and smiled as I entered with 3 cups of coffee. "You know, you don't have to bring us coffee anymore," she joked. "Now you're the head of the legal department." I replied, "Old habits die hard," placing a cup on her desk and another on Josue's as he finished a call. The past 6 months had been a roller coaster of emotions and changes. The trial against Clara and Marisol had been quick and decisive, with all the evidence we had gathered and the confessions of other employees who finally dared to speak. They had no escape. Clara was sentenced to 12 years in prison for fraud, document manipulation, and embezzlement. Marisol received 8 years for complicity and corporate fraud. "Do you remember when you asked me about my blind date?" I said to Josue when he finished his call. He smiled, taking a sip of his coffee. "The famous date that triggered everything," he replied, standing up to give me a kiss on the cheek. "Although now I know it was part of the plan," he added. Carmen chimed in with a mischievous smile. "Yes, there was a scheduled date that day with Detective Rivera, the one who handled Josue's case." Josue looked surprised, and I nodded. We needed everything to be legal and by the book. I met with him that afternoon to finalize the details of the operation, which is why I arrived late at the reunion. The intercom interrupted our conversation, and the news secretary announced that the trust documents were ready. Carmen stood up, smoothing her skirt nervously. "Are you sure about this?" she asked again. Josue and I replied in unison, "Completely." We went downstairs, where the notary was waiting with the papers. The new trust established that a significant portion of the company's profits would go to a foundation to help separated families reconnect and support single mothers who wanted to continue their studies. Roberto would be proud, I commented as we signed the documents. Not just of the foundation, but of seeing his children working together. After finishing the paperwork, we went up to the rooftop, which had become our Friday tradition. We shared a bottle of wine while watching the sunset over the city. Carmen asked softly, "Do you think Mom really loved us?" Josue hugged her. In her own twisted way, I think she did, but she confused love with control and ambition. I added, "The important thing is that we broke that cycle, and now we can build something new, something better." As the sun began to set, painting the sky with pink and orange hues, Josue pulled me towards him. The three of us stood in silence, contemplating the horizon. Carmen spoke up after a moment, "By the way, have you decided on a wedding date, Josue and you?" Josue and I exchanged a knowing glance. "Spring," I replied, playing with the engagement ring on my finger. "When the cherry blossoms are in bloom, just like in the first photo we found of Dad with Carmen," Josue added. He always said spring was the time for new beginnings. As the last ray of sunlight disappeared over the horizon, I raised my glass. To new beginnings, to the truth, and to the love that surpasses all lies, to family, Carmen added with tears of happiness in her eyes. To us, Josue completed, kissing me softly. And so, as night fell over the city, I realized that sometimes destiny takes strange paths to lead us exactly where we need to be. Years of pain and separation had led us to this moment, three broken people who had finally found their way back home.